So here is a brief bio and photograph of our presenter, Christina, who's a registered early childhood educator. Christina is also a resource consultant and a certified member with the Association of Early Childhood Educators, Ontario. Christina has been working in the field for 14 years and has experience as a frontline staff. She's also been in supervisory roles in multiple childcare centers and worked in an early childhood development center. Christina was also a designated early childhood educator in a school board, and most recently, she has been a resource consultant in various agencies supporting both licensed childcare centers and home childcare throughout the Niagara region. Christina is interested in mental health and recently completed her certificate in children's mental health through Mohawk College. She has a continued passion for learning and is currently enrolled in the University of Guelph Humber program, where she's taking an honors Bachelor of Applied Science degree in early childhood studies. She also has aspirations to complete her master's degree one day. Christina is active in the community. She sits on various committees, such as the Quality Childcare Niagara Task Group, as well as the Infant Mental Health Niagara Advisory Committee. She has recently joined the College of Early Childhood Educators as a subject matter advisor, and she hopes to continue mentoring and supporting colleagues in the future on a variety of different subjects, tonight being one of them. So that's all from me. I'm going to turn the presentation over and our time over tonight to Christina, who is going to share her experience, her professional experience related to Standard 6, confidentiality and releasing information related to children and families. So welcome, Christina. We're glad you're here.
Wonderful. Thank you, Meredith, so much. Again, I just want to say hello to everybody and thank you for joining us this evening. As I walk through the slides, I just want to let you know I'm not going to be reading them word for word. So again, I'm going to have information up there that you can kind of read through. And I have my own speaking notes here that I'm just going to kind of talk about these things as we go through and share my own personal experiences with you. So today we're focusing on Standard 6, specifically in regards to confidentiality and release of information. So I personally feel that the standard can be linked in each area of our code of ethics, but most specifically to responsibilities to children and to families. Our ECEs build and maintain responsive and collaborative relationships with families. These relationships are based on mutual trust, openness, and respect for confidentiality. RECEs work in partnership with families, sharing knowledge and resources to support the well-being and learning of children. So we have the responsibility to effectively communicate with families, colleagues, and other professionals and build responsive relationships with them. And the way we do this is through effective communication. So one of our most significant roles within our profession is keeping all information gathered and obtained confidential and knowing when and how we are able to release information. So tonight we'll be focusing on this and reflecting on best practices that follow our code of ethics. So before we get into the discussion tonight, I just want to share that RECEs are required by law to follow legislation in keeping all obtained information regarding the child and family confidential and protected. We do so by complying with our policies and procedures of our place of employment that adheres to privacy legislation acts in conjunction to following the Child Care and Early Years Act, as well as the Early Childhood Educators Act. So please note, this list above is not an exhaustive list of applicable privacy legislation, again, but just some examples of legislation that we do follow. So what are some basic ways in which we keep information confidential and protected? Well, we have filing cabinets that lock up our files. We ensure that we do not include any identifiable information or personal information on forms that could be seen by others in the classroom, unless we need to as required for other purposes. So documentation that stays in our rooms should contain only relevant information that we would need to access for programming purposes. So such as having a child support plan available to reference, but ensuring we put it away where it belongs once we're finished with it. These are common practices that we cover on a day-to-day basis. Throughout our conversations tonight, we're also going to discuss and reflect on areas that maybe are not as common as these practices. We'll cover different scenarios that we may come across, and I will share some of my own personal reflections on how I dealt with some of these things throughout my practice and in my career. So we're going to start first on the topic of confidentiality. We covered this a bit in our discussion on privacy legislation. So we are responsible to gather consent before openly discussing a child and their family. This happens at time of registration when a family signs forms allowing us to gather basic information about their child while in our professional care. However, we have to remember that there are so many different ways in which we can share information about a child, and we have to always be aware that the family will or will not allow you to disclose or share information. So this can be as basic as posting a picture of the child when the family did not consent for you to do so. When we have so many things that are, on the go through our day-to-day, doings, it's easy for us to forget things. And in my practice, I always try to be conscious of double checking if I'm not 100% sure. There are so many ways in which we can break confidentiality even without being aware of it. Suppose you left a center and moved to a new place of employment, and you still see those staff members from the old place from time to time, and you ask about a specific child. I know this is human nature, but technically we're not supposed to discuss children and families outside of the scope of practice in which we're allowed. So again, by asking this question to your old center colleagues, you're putting them in a position to break confidentiality because the child is in attendance at their center. I've been in this position before, and I've had to learn to refrain of asking even when I wanted to. This topic also links into dual relationships, which has been previously discussed in the Standards Matters series prior for standard number 5. We also have to remember our professional boundaries and keeping information confidential. One thing as I was preparing these notes and what I wanted to discuss with you, if you are a DECE in the classroom, I do have a couple years experience in teaching in the Catholic board here in Niagara. And it was a real learning curve for me as well, because I had come from strict policy and regulation through the child care centers. And when I got to the school board, it looked very different to me in terms of how we keep information confidential and how we are releasing information. One thing that came to mind and I just wanted to speak to you about was how you're keeping information confidential within your classrooms. So when I think about it, we have children's files that are kept locked up safe within the office, but what about all of our other running records, information that we do have within our classroom? I remember there were so many times we had wonderful students, older students, that would like to come down to our room on their recess break and help to straighten up the classroom, help to tidy. They like to do some prep work. And just so always being aware of what you're keeping out there. Most cases, teachers don't have filing cabinets in their classrooms, especially for us educators. In the kindergarten rooms, it's not something we always have access to with lock and key. And we do have information and records that are available. If we have children who maybe have IEPs already, personal information that's identifiable to the child, any type of information regarding a diagnosis. So again, we used to just keep things kind of in our binder and tucked away up on the shelf, but we always have to keep in mind that there are many people with much more access coming in and out of the classrooms. So it's just something to think about in terms of how you're storing your information, and maybe it might be a good idea to have a locked cupboard installed in your classroom. Just something like I shared to think about. So moving on, a key component through this communication process with families, colleagues, and other professionals is building relationships and mutual trust. When you build a strong rapport with others, they feel more confident in opening up and sharing information with you. So this is always what we want, to build a strong relationship with the family for the sake of the child and their best interest. But we also have to be mindful of how much information gathered is too much and if it's really relevant. So this can also happen between professionals, and we have to remember our professional obligations. Sometimes for me, I go into programs and have staff ask me about a child in their room that they may have genuine concerns about. I have to remind them that we are not allowed to discuss the child if they're not on my caseload, as there has been no confidentiality agreement signed by the family stating my involvement. So this again is not only for the protection of the rights of the child, but also for ourselves as staff. I always think about, what would a parent say if they found out you were disclosing information about their child to another professional without their consent? Especially to a professional whose role can be very sensitive in discussing the development of a child. So again, just something to think about. I know there are resource consultants who are available to you and coming in your classroom, but we just have to be really mindful of the family's privacy. And if we do have genuine concern, again, really building the relationship first with the families to gain consent to move forward in speaking with other professionals. And sometimes this can be a really difficult thing. I have staff coming to me saying, we really need help. This child is exhibiting behavior A, B, and C. We don't know what to do. And I know it can be a very difficult and challenging thing. So that's why we really have to collaborate and work together as a team for the best interest of the child. So families have a right to know and understand why we are collecting information on their child and what the purpose of it serves. There are many reasons why we collect information, such as for licensing purposes, documentation, observations, and learning more about the child. It is our responsibility to inform families why and how the information will be collected and gathered, what the intent and purpose or use of the information is for, as well as who will be collecting it. So information collection can be used for very specific reasons, such as for a resource consultant like myself, to gather observations to create goals for the child within their program. Before outside individuals can gather information, The families need to share consent that their information can be released to our services. So once a referral is received, we need to obtain consent before we can start our end of the process. These examples, again, just show how precise we need to be at every stage in collecting and sharing confidential information regarding a child and their family, and again, the key to access consent. So it's definitely a learning curve. So how can you ensure you're following your agency's policies and procedures, along with adhering to the code of ethics and standards of practice? So I think a good way would be to find a leader along with your supervisor who can mentor you and help to build your skill set in working with families, and how to build a strong relationship based on mutual respect, especially through sensitive times when we have to gather that confidential information and release that information to other professionals about their child. So we have a couple reflection questions here tonight that we've inserted in just to kind of get you thinking about different scenarios that you may have come across in your practice or even your colleagues throughout the years or throughout your time in different roles. So this question states, at evening pickup, a school-age child runs over to their parent to tell them that a child with autism hit them. This conversation occurs just as you're on your way over to discuss the incident with the parent and have them sign the report you had completed. So, since the child has told the parent the details of what happened, what are you able to disclose about the situation or the other child? And what would you do? So as I kind of go through and discuss this, I really want you to think about a scenario that may have been similar to you with your practice and how you kind of got through it. Did you deal with the situation on your own? Did you talk with your classroom partner about it? Is it something that you had to bring to your supervisor's attention? Again, was it something that turned into a much larger conflict, or was it something that was okay and accepted by the parent? So I've had this scenario happen before with children on my caseload. Oftentimes, staff will approach me the next time I'm in their center for a visit and share that they didn't know what to do. So this scenario can be very challenging and distressful to staff. It's just our natural ability to want to disclose to the parent that yes, the child does have autism, and hope that they will be more empathetic to the situation. But in reality, we cannot disclose this information. All we can do is share that we are addressing the behavior and that the situation has been appropriately dealt with. If this is an ongoing thing, then we need to look at how to further address the situation. So I once had a family who disclosed to the other family that their child did have a diagnosis when they found out their child was hitting another peer. So again, this reflective question is based on a personal experience with the center that I support that we did have. And it was an ongoing challenge. And I think it took a lot of hard work for us to walk through it and in protecting the privacy of the family and of the child. And when mom was aware of it, actually, and on her own terms, she did come to, again, the other family and share that, yes, my child has a diagnosis, but that's not always the case. And families sometimes are not comfortable in sharing that. So again, all we can do is just reassure the other family that the situation is being dealt with in the most appropriate way. I just have a second question for you as well here from this scenario, and it would also be to watch what you say even in front of other children. So should you be using diagnoses and labels in front of other children? First of all, it's not very sensitive to the pertaining child. And second of all, you are sharing confidential information in the classroom that, again, may not be relevant. So always thinking about that and going back to that, even in just being aware of how you're speaking within the classroom, especially if you have older children. So depending on the age of the child, they are aware of and retain what information you are sharing about their peers. So if you're constantly bringing up the fact that little Johnny is in the classroom and he has autism, then Susie now knows, and that's why she just informed her mom of this when she shared that Johnny hit her. All right, so again, especially with those older kindergarten and school-age children, just being really respectful of them, regardless if they have a diagnosis or not, if they have a behavior or not. We always have to be aware of how we're speaking about them. We want to praise and uplift our children. We don't want to be degrading them. Again, a diagnosis doesn't even matter. It doesn't change who they are as a person, and that is the main key point to this. Now we're going to move on to release of information regarding children and families. So again, you're going to see this ties in a lot with confidentiality, and we're going to touch base on some of the same topics as well throughout. So again, we've spoken about this within confidentiality as the two topics, they're interrelated. We obtain consent from families before sharing of information unless disclosure without consent is permitted or required by law. Part of the piece of Standard 6, which I am not discussing tonight, is on duty to report. So again, we are required by law to disclose information if it does fall into that category, and I just want to make you aware of that. An area that I find can get really tricky is when you're supporting a family who may be separated. So we have to be very careful in ensuring we obtain a release of information from both parties regarding their child if there is joint custody before we can move forward. So sometimes families are not in agreement, and this can make things very tricky in proceeding with any additional types of services. This is definitely where relationship building comes into play. So even if the parties are not on good terms, we have to remember that we can be the common ground and help to support them for their child. So when working with separated families, we have to remember as well that what has been shared by one parent may not be known by the other parent, and we must respect that confidentiality again. So when working with the families, we have to remember to set boundaries and keep it professional. I have been in this situation many times. It's not easy, and again, it takes more work. So I know sometimes staff were eager to move forward and, just gain any kind of support that we need for that child. But if we have to go back and forth through two parents and have them sign the same forms, it does take additional time, and we just have to take a break, pause, slow down, and just know that regardless, we're going to be much further ahead when we're building that strong relationship with them. So allowing them to know that we genuinely care about their child, we are here to support them through the process, not only the process that they're going through with their child, but also just to support their family and themselves and what they've had to deal with through the separation. I'm also thinking about staff who may be employed in co-op nursery school programs. I am in a co-op nursery school right now. I have a child there that I support. And in thinking about confidentiality and releasing information, this can be a very tricky situation. Years ago myself, I worked as a frontline staff, also in the co-ops, and although they really don't exist anymore, there's far and few between, they are still relevant within our communities, and we do have staff who are employed as well as family members who take on the role of staff within the classroom. So we have to be very careful in what we're sharing, and that can make it difficult when family members are always present within the classroom. So when it comes to my role, if I have a child who has an ISP, so that's their individualized support plan, we definitely can share that with consent from the family because those individuals are in the classroom. So they're also there to support that child by working on goals with them and helping to have them succeed. Where we're crossing the line and maybe overstepping boundaries is sharing detailed personal information that the family does not need to know, and that may not be relevant. So when I'm in the classroom, I can talk openly with the parents and the staff member there. But if it comes to any kind of medical or personal issues or something that happened at therapy, I just keep it private, again, to myself and to the staff member, and always think about the relevancy of what it is that I'm sharing. So when releasing information, we always have to be sensitive to what it is that we are sharing, whether it be with families or other professionals. And this is really, when I was thinking about it, I think that sometimes we really get desensitized to situations that may be of common practice to us, such as working with a child who's maybe just received a diagnosis of autism. But we have to remember that to families, this is all brand new. We have to be supportive of their feelings and how they are coping. So before we release information, also we want to consider the day the parent had. Are they running in to pick up their child later than usual? Is now a good time to approach them with concerns? When sharing confidential information and releasing information, we must always be aware of our audience. So who is in the room? What is their role? What information is being shared? And what is the sensitivity of the topic? Are you able to get coverage to have the conversation privately in the office? Does an additional person need to be present? So these are all things that we need to think of. It's also our responsibility to inform families on why we are gathering information and who we are releasing it to. So again, is it required for licensing purposes? Is it to access additional services? What if a family shares that their child has received a diagnosis or is on new medication? Do you share that with the staff? How do you approach this? Again, you have to remember the relevance. Will it directly affect the child while in care at your program? If they are on a new medication, maybe. So maybe the other staffs need to be aware of any possible side effects. In situations like these, again, based on your relationship, if the family is comfortable and trusts your professional judgment, they more than likely will allow you to disclose that with others. But what about the new diagnosis? So I come across this a lot where a family may receive a diagnosis for their child, but does not want me to disclose that to the child care staff. Again, I have to keep that information confidential and respect their wishes. So looking at the relevance, a diagnosis does not change who the child is. Keeping this information confidential also protects my credibility as a professional and my duties to uphold. So sometimes you may not agree with a decision a family may make in not wanting to disclose, but again, we have to respect their confidentiality. So we have to be aware of beliefs and biases that may impact observation and documentation, as well as putting stereotypes on certain populations. We have to keep observation and documentation relevant and factual, not adding information that is not relevant or necessary, especially when others are sharing in this, such as through apps like Hi Mama, where staff share information with families regarding their child. There are so many different means of information sharing through technology such as email, text, social media such as Twitter and Instagram. Again, I don't know what platform you may use through your work, how you're sharing documentation, but just always being aware of what you're sharing, especially through technology. Once we put something out there, it's stuck out there and we can't always retract that. So always thinking about the relevance of what you're sharing, what the intent is, why you're sharing it, and if you really have to. We have to ensure that we are only releasing what was consented by the families and nothing more. So ways in which we can protect information of a child and keep it more confidential is to use initials instead of full names. Do not include any identifying information, and not releasing anything personal through your observations and documentation. So I always like to think of the extreme to put things into perspective. So would it be acceptable to put this in the headline of a newspaper? Thinking in this over-exaggerated context will help you to remember to stop and think about what you're sharing before you're sharing it. So on to our second reflective question for the evening. Family shares that their child has just been picked up for speech therapy and has disclosed which therapist they will be working with. You know the speech language pathologist and you take it upon yourself to connect with them. So is verbal consent sufficient to contact the service provider? Although it may be out of good intentions, without signed consent, we cannot release information about a child. We have to think about the breakdown of this conversation. Just because you were informed by the family does not mean they were allowing you to call up this professional right away and discuss their child. We have to be sensitive to the fact that this may be a new process for them. So sitting down to talk with them about how they're feeling when we do gain that written consent is another great way to build on that relationship. So even if we have gained consent, we have to wait until the other party has gained consent before we can discuss confidential information and release of information regarding a child. Again, this is for the protection of the rights of the child as well as ourselves as a professional. And that's a key point that I really want to stress throughout the evening. We always have to think about both the protection of the child and family as well as ourselves as a professional, because we do have that duty to keep everything confidential. So I am in this position quite often, and again, I think I touched base on it before. It can be really frustrating at these checkpoints whenever you're having to wait to gain consent or to release information before gathering more information. But the thing is, just knowing in the back of your head that you're following the correct policy and procedure, really reflecting on that privacy legislation piece that we talked about at the beginning of the webinar this evening. And that's just part of our professional duty. And we have to continue to recognize that we are professionals, that things take time. Nothing moves as quickly as we would like it to. But in the end, as things come full circle back to us, things will get straightened out and worked out. It's never the end of the world. There's always ways in which we are able to cope, and we're going to find support. And I know sometimes it can be a difficult thing, but again, it's key. It's key that we follow confidentiality. So to conclude, I want to share that there is a Try It at Work document that will be available to you. And this has guided a lot of my conversation throughout my reflection time with you this evening. So the resource will be most beneficial in guiding your reflective thinking and digging deeper into different scenarios and helping you to generate ideas and conversations with your colleagues to help build your confidence within the scope of confidentiality and release of information. So I want to thank Meredith and the College of Early Childhood Educators for this opportunity to share with you this evening. And I thank you, viewers, for participating with me. And I wish you much success on your journeys.